I didn't plan on falling in love with a man capable of killing someone. If you had asked me a year ago what kind of danger I was afraid of, I would have said loneliness, not violence. But loneliness has a way of preparing you for the wrong kind of attachment. And by the time I understood what Daniel really was, I had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It was raining the night we met properly, the kind of heavy New York rain that turns sidewalks into mirrors and makes everyone move a little faster. I was 34, recently divorced, and staying too late at work on purpose. My therapist called it avoidance. I called it productivity. My apartment on the Upper West Side still carried traces of my former life, books we bought together, a dent in the couch where my ex-husband used to sit, silence that felt less like peace and more like accusation. Daniel worked security in the same Midtown building as my law firm. I had seen him before, of course, but New York teaches you not to look too closely at strangers. The first time we were forced into proximity was when the elevator stalled between floors late one evening. It was just the two of us inside that small metal box, suspended somewhere between 23 and 24, and instead of making awkward conversation or pressing the emergency button repeatedly like most people would, he simply leaned back against the wall and studied me. "You're not okay," he said after a while, not with pity, but with certainty. I remember laughing in a way that sounded sharper than I intended. No one had said anything that direct to me in months. My colleagues saw competence. My friends saw resilience. My ex-husband had eventually stopped seeing me at all. Yet this man, who barely knew my name, noticed the way I pressed my lips together when I was holding back tears. That should have unsettled me. Instead, it felt like relief. We began talking after that. At first, casually in the lobby, then outside the building while we waited for the rain to ease, and eventually over late-night takeout in the security office. He told me he had once been a police officer in Brooklyn, but had left after an incident he described only as complicated. I didn't press him for details because part of me enjoyed the mystery. After years of predictability, ambiguity felt intoxicating. Daniel had a calm presence that bordered on protective. The first time he walked me home, it was because a man had followed me from the subway. Daniel didn't threaten him or raise his voice. He simply fixed him with a steady look that made the stranger disappear down the next block. I told myself it was coincidence that I began timing my departures to match his shifts. When I finally went to his apartment in Williamsburg, it was by choice, not chance. The place was spare to the point of anonymity. Exposed brick, neutral furniture, no photographs, no visible history. I remember noticing that absence and deciding it meant he valued privacy. Now I wonder if it meant he preferred not to leave evidence of who he had been before. Daniel about loneliness in a way that felt almost clinical, dissecting it as though it were a shared condition rather than a weakness. I told him about my divorce, about the miscarriage that had hollowed out our marriage long before the paperwork was filed. Daniel listened without interruption, his attention so focused it felt almost like being examined under bright light. When he said I deserved someone who would protect me, the word lodged itself somewhere deep inside my chest. Protection sounded steadier than love, less fragile. The night everything changed began quietly at my apartment. We had finished dinner, and the city lights shimmered against the windows, while rain traced slow lines down the glass. His phone buzzed, and I watched as his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He didn't look afraid. He looked analytical, as if a calculation had just altered. He told me he needed to step out briefly. I questioned the timing, but not strongly enough. When he returned nearly 2 hours later, his knuckles were scraped raw, and there was a faint smear of blood on the cuff of his jacket. He did not attempt to hide it. Instead, he watched my reaction with unsettling attentiveness. He told me a man had been harassing a woman in the building for months, and that the confrontation had escalated in the parking garage. According to him, the man had fallen during the struggle. The word felt too convenient, but I was a lawyer. I understood how narratives could be shaped. Accidents are often defined by perspective. When I suggested calling the police, Daniel gently outlined the likely outcome. The dead man had prior charges, he said. The woman would not testify. The system would not reward nuance. He wasn't asking me to break the law, he implied. He was asking me to understand how it actually worked. I wish I could say I argued longer. The truth is that I didn't. Some combination of affection, pride, and a dangerous desire to be indispensable pushed me toward a decision that would alter everything. We drove to the garage together. It was nearly empty, the concrete amplifying the echo of our steps. The man lay at the base of the stairwell, his body twisted in a way that suggested violence, even if the story would later claim accident. When I crouched beside him, I felt a flicker of revulsion, but it was quickly overtaken by something steadier and far more troubling: focus. I began to think in legal frameworks, angles of cameras, blind spots, response times. I knew which reports could be delayed and how language could soften implication. I hated how naturally those calculations came to me. I hated, even more, the sense of purpose that replaced my hesitation. Daniel told me I didn't have to be there, but there was no real doubt between us. Helping him bound us together in a way that affection alone never could. By the time we left the garage, the outline of a believable story was already in place. 3 days later, the news reported that a repeat offender had died in a fall inside a parking structure. No foul play suspected. Case closed. Daniel kissed me that night with a kind of gratitude that felt almost reverent, and I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind us. It wasn't. Because a week later, another woman from our building disappeared. And Daniel did not look surprised when I told him. At first, I told myself there was no connection. New York is a city of millions. People leave all the time. Apartments empty overnight, leases break, lives rearrange without explanation. But the missing woman, Claire Whitmore, had lived on the same floor as the first victim's alleged harassment target. She worked in finance, jogged every morning, and had posted a photo of her rooftop view less than 12 hours before she vanished. I learned all of that before Daniel did, which, in hindsight, feels ironic. When I mentioned her disappearance casually over dinner, I expected him to show concern, or at least mild surprise. Instead, his reaction was almost studied. He asked practical questions about timelines and last sightings, the way someone might inquire about weather conditions rather than a missing person. "You think it's related?" I asked carefully. He held my gaze for a second too long before shaking his head. "Coincidences happen more often than people like to believe." The statement was logical, but something beneath it felt rehearsed. Over the next few days, small inconsistencies began to surface. Daniel started working late more often, though security schedules in our building were usually predictable. When I dropped by unexpectedly one evening, another guard mentioned that Daniel had swapped shifts multiple times that week. When I confronted him about it, he explained that he was covering for someone dealing with family issues. The explanation was plausible, but his tone suggested I was the one overstepping by asking. I began to notice other details. a new scratch along his forearm that he attributed to a broken cabinet hinge, a duffel bag in his closet that I had never seen before, the way he occasionally checked his phone and turned the screen away from me. My instincts, honed by years of evaluating testimony and reading between lines, were whispering that the narrative I had accepted might not be the whole truth. Yet every time doubt surfaced, I remembered the garage and the choice I'd made. If Daniel was guilty of something more than self-defense, I was already complicit. That knowledge had a silencing effect. The turning point came 2 weeks after Claire's disappearance, when detectives began canvassing residents in our building. They knocked on my door in the early evening, badges displayed, voices polite but probing. I answered their questions with controlled neutrality, careful not to offer more than necessary. When they asked about Daniel specifically, how well I knew him, how often I saw him, something inside me tightened. Their interest was subtle but unmistakable. They were not accusing, they were gathering. That night, I told Daniel about the visit. Instead of reacting defensively, he seemed almost thoughtful. "They're just doing their job," he said. "You didn't mention the garage, did you?" The question hung between us longer than it should have. "Of course not," I replied, though I resented the implication. He stepped closer and touched my face with a gentleness that might have comforted me weeks earlier. Now it felt strategic. "We're in this together," he said softly. For the first time, the phrase sounded less like intimacy and more like containment. I couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. 2 women connected by proximity. 1 dead man, Daniel, present at the center of each orbit. My legal training told me that patterns matter more than isolated events, so I did something I never imagined I would do. I started investigating the man I loved. I accessed public records first, former addresses, disciplinary notes from his time in the police department, archived complaints that had never made headlines. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. There had indeed been an incident in Brooklyn 5 years earlier involving excessive force during an arrest. The charges were dropped, but internal reviews referenced aggression that exceeded protocol. Then I found something else. A woman named Marissa Kane had filed a restraining order against him 2 years ago. The petition described controlling behavior, escalating intimidation, and threats that were vague enough to avoid prosecution, but specific enough to terrify. The restraining order had been withdrawn 3 months later. The reason field was blank. When Daniel came home that evening, I studied him the way he had once studied me in that stalled elevator. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. "What's going on in that head of yours?" he asked lightly. I considered confronting him outright, placing the documents on the table and demanding explanation. Instead, I chose caution. I had learned from him, after all. "I've just been thinking," I said, "about how little we really know about each other's pasts." For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his expression. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. "We know what matters," he replied. The answer was both intimate and evasive. That night, I lay awake listening to his breathing beside me and replayed every conversation we had ever had. I remembered how easily he had framed the first death as necessity, how he had guided my reasoning until helping him felt like my own idea. I remembered the warmth of the body in the garage and the clarity I had mistaken for strength. A terrible possibility began to form. What if the man in the garage had not fallen at all? And what if I had not been his first accomplice? As the city hummed faintly beyond the windows, I realized something that chilled me more than any police knock ever could. If Daniel was orchestrating something darker than I had allowed myself to see, then loving him had not simply put me in danger. It had made me useful. And the most dangerous part was that I still didn't know whether I wanted to expose him or protect him again. There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't make you run. It makes you organize. By the time suspicion settled into something heavier than doubt, I wasn't panicking. I was preparing. For days, I watched Daniel the way he had once watched me. Not with open curiosity, but with quiet analysis. I paid attention to the cadence of his routines, the timing of his shifts, the subtle tension in his shoulders when certain names appeared on the news. When Claire Whitmore's disappearance was upgraded from missing person to suspected foul play, he absorbed the update with an almost clinical calm. Too calm. I decided that if I wanted the truth, I couldn't confront him directly. Daniel didn't respond to accusation, he responded to leverage. So I created some. The first step was securing myself. I copied every document I had found about his past: the internal police review, the withdrawn restraining order, archived complaints, and uploaded them to a private cloud folder scheduled to forward automatically to a colleague if I failed to log in every 72 hours. It was a precaution I justified as rational, though part of me knew it was also an admission. I no longer felt safe. The second step was more dangerous. I returned to the parking garage, not to relive what had happened, but to examine what I had missed. Security footage is often overwritten quickly in residential buildings unless flagged. I had flagged portions of it that night to support the story we constructed, carefully narrowing the timeline so it suggested an altercation followed by a fall outside the clearest camera angle. At the time, I told myself I was shaping chaos into coherence. Now, I wanted to see what existed beyond the frame I had chosen. Using credentials Daniel had once casually shared with me, an intimacy he probably thought harmless, I accessed archived system logs. There it was, a gap. 8 minutes of footage manually disabled before the confrontation we had described. Disabled by an internal override. By him. The fall had never been accidental. It had been engineered. My pulse remained steady as I stared at the screen. The steadiness frightened me more than hysteria would have. Somewhere along the way, I had begun thinking like him. The implications were worse than I expected. If the first death was deliberate, then my role had not been to help him avoid injustice. It had been to sanitize a crime. And that meant Claire's disappearance was unlikely to be coincidence. That night, when Daniel returned home, he sensed the shift immediately. He always did. "You're quiet," he observed, setting his keys down with deliberate calm. "I've been thinking about the garage," I replied, watching his face carefully. He didn't flinch. He simply removed his jacket and folded it over the chair as if we were discussing grocery lists. "What about it?" I rewatched the footage. There it was, the smallest pause, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. And? There were 8 minutes missing before the fall. The silence between us felt architectural, like something constructed rather than accidental. Daniel stepped closer, not aggressively, but with intention. "Why would you go digging like that?" The question wasn't angry. It was disappointed. I needed to know what I actually helped you cover up. For the first time since I had known him, the mask slipped. Not fully, but enough. The warmth that had once felt protective cooled into something sharper. You think you understand what happened, he said quietly. But you're looking at it like a lawyer, not like someone who knows what that man was capable of. That's not an answer. His jaw tightened. Sometimes prevention doesn't look pretty. The phrase echoed in my mind long after he said it. Prevention. As if he had appointed himself judge of future harm. And Claire? I asked, keeping my voice even. Was she prevention too? His gaze hardened in a way I had never seen before. For a second, I thought he might deny everything outright. Instead, he chose something subtler. You're letting paranoia fill in blanks, he said. The police are circling because they need someone to blame. Don't make it easy for them. The way he said them made it sound as though we were already on one side together. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I no longer felt like his partner. I felt like an asset he was evaluating. Over the next week, I tested him. I fabricated a story about a coworker who had confided in me about an abusive ex-boyfriend and mentioned that the man sometimes waited outside her building. It was a deliberate echo of the narrative he had used the night of the garage. Daniel listened with controlled interest. Does she want help? He asked. Not officially, I replied. She's afraid of escalating it. He nodded slowly, and for a moment, I saw calculation again. The same internal math I'd witnessed the night his phone buzzed before the first death. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. He didn't stumble into these situations. He curated them. Whether through coincidence, suggestion, or subtle manipulation, he placed himself near vulnerability and then justified intervention as necessity. In his mind, he wasn't committing crimes. He was correcting imbalances. And I had been the perfect partner because I understood how to rewrite the aftermath. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. A detective called me directly, asking if I would come in for a follow-up conversation. His tone was measured, but edged with something firmer than before. When I arrived at the precinct, he slid a photograph across the table. It was Claire, entering the parking garage with Daniel. Not the night of her disappearance, 2 weeks earlier. He said he barely knew her, the detective noted calmly. I studied the image. Daniel's posture was relaxed, almost familiar. Claire appeared mid-conversation, not distressed. Why show me this? I asked. Because you're smart, he replied. And because sometimes the person standing next to the fire doesn't realize they're holding the match. On the way home, I didn't cry. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't confront him. Instead, I made a decision. If he had been orchestrating these scenarios, if he believed himself righteous enough to decide who posed a future threat, then he relied on one crucial assumption: that I would always choose him. So I let him believe that. That night, I apologized for doubting him. I told him stress had gotten to me and that the detectives had unnerved me. I let my voice soften, allowed vulnerability to seep back into my posture. Relief flickered across his face, subtle but unmistakable. He pulled me close and whispered that everything would be fine, that the investigation would fade, that we just had to stay aligned. Aligned. The word tasted bitter. Because while he thought I was recommitting myself to him, I was doing something else entirely. I was setting the stage. If Daniel wanted control, he would have it. Just not in the way he expected. And for the first time since the garage, I felt something familiar return. Not love, not fear. but clarity. The kind that comes right before you decide who survives the story. The most dangerous shift in any relationship isn't when you stop loving someone. It's when you start understanding them. After the meeting with the detective, I didn't feel betrayed in the way I expected. I felt clarified. The photograph of Daniel and Claire entering the garage together hadn't shattered me. It had rearranged the pieces into a shape that finally made sense. Daniel wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. And methodical men make mistakes only when they believe they've accounted for everything. He believed he had accounted for me. That assumption would be his only miscalculation. For the next 2 weeks, I played my role perfectly. I stopped asking questions. I leaned into him when he spoke. I let him believe my earlier doubts had been nothing more than anxiety triggered by police attention. At the same time, I built something quiet and irreversible behind his back. I met the detective again, not at the precinct, but in a coffee shop near Columbus Circle. Public enough to feel safe, anonymous enough to avoid drawing attention. "I can't testify without implicating myself," I told him calmly. "But I can give you structure." He studied me carefully. "Structure?" "Patterns, timing, access." I didn't confess outright. I didn't describe the garage in detail. What I did instead was outline the psychological profile of a man who positions himself near perceived threats and escalates under the belief that he's preventing future harm. I framed it as theory. I let the detective connect it to Daniel on his own. "You're saying he selects people he can justify," the detective said. "I'm saying he needs to believe he's righteous," I replied. That distinction mattered, because righteous men rarely stop on their own. The breakthrough came when another woman filed a harassment complaint within our building. Her name was Elena Morales, late 20s, lived alone, reported that someone had been lingering near her floor and leaving notes that weren't overtly threatening, but deeply unsettling. The complaint was logged internally before police became involved. Daniel had access to those logs. When I learned about it, I felt the cold certainty of inevitability. The pattern was presenting itself again. Vulnerability, proximity, opportunity. So, I accelerated the timeline. That night, I told Daniel about Elena as if I were merely concerned. I watched his face carefully as I described the situation. He asked questions, practical ones, about schedules and whether she had contacted law enforcement. "She's hesitant," I said softly. "She thinks she might be overreacting." He nodded slowly, and there it was again, the calculation behind his eyes. That was all the confirmation I needed. I had already prepared the final step. 2 days earlier, I had accessed the building's internal system and restored a hidden feature Daniel likely assumed no one else knew existed. Redundant remote backup of live camera feeds. Not the edited logs, the raw stream. I provided the detective with temporary access credentials and a single instruction. Watch the garage. On Friday night, Daniel left our apartment around 10:30 p.m. He kissed me before he went and told me he needed to check something at work. His tone was steady, affectionate, almost tender. I waited exactly 7 minutes before opening my laptop. The live feed showed him entering the garage alone. At 10:42 p.m., Elena's car pulled in. She stepped out, unaware. Daniel approached her with the same controlled posture I had once mistaken for calm strength. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. I recognized the rhythm of his body language, the slight lean forward, the measured gestures designed to appear reassuring. Then, something shifted. Elena stepped back. Daniel reached for her arm. That was when the detectives moved in. The frame erupted into motion. Officers entering from both sides, commands shouted, Daniel pinned against concrete. Elena stumbled away, shaken but unharmed. I watched without blinking. When they cuffed him, he didn't struggle. He scanned the garage instead, eyes sharp and searching, as if trying to locate the variable he had failed to account for. For a brief, impossible second, I thought he was looking at me through the camera. He called me from custody an hour later. "I know it was you," he said quietly. There was no rage in his voice, only recognition. "You set me up." "I stopped you," I corrected. A faint exhale. "You could have just walked away." "You would have found someone else." Silence lingered between us, heavy with everything unspoken. "You think you're different?" he asked finally. "You helped me once. You didn't hesitate." The words struck deeper than I expected because they were true. "I hesitated," I replied softly. "I just chose wrong." "No," he said. "You chose what felt powerful." That was the last thing he said before the line disconnected. The arrest triggered a cascade. Investigators reopened the parking garage death. The missing footage I had discovered became central evidence. Claire's case was reclassified. Search warrants followed. And inevitably, my involvement surfaced. I was not charged with murder, but I was charged. Accessory after the fact, obstruction. My legal team negotiated carefully, emphasizing cooperation, evidence provided, prevention of further harm. I received probation and lost my position at the firm. The bar review process remains ongoing. In interviews, I am described as manipulated, as a woman drawn in by a charismatic man with a savior complex. Sometimes I let that narrative stand. It's convenient. But it isn't entirely true. Because on the night in the garage, before I knew about Claire or Elena, before detectives and strategy and redemption arcs, I felt something disturbingly close to exhilaration. I liked being necessary. I liked being chosen as the person trusted with darkness. That part of me existed before Daniel. He didn't create it. He recognized it. And I recognized it in him. I visit him once before the trial begins. The glass between us reflects two versions of who we were. The woman who wanted protection, and the man who believed he was justice. "You could have left with me," he says calmly. "We were good together." "No," I answer. "We were efficient together." A faint smile touches his lips, almost proud. "You'll miss it," he says. I don't respond, because he's not entirely wrong. There are nights when the city feels too quiet and my life too ordinary. When I remember the clarity of that garage and the way decisions felt sharp and immediate. But then I think of Elena's face in the camera feed, the moment before intervention. And I remind myself that clarity without conscience is just another form of violence. Daniel awaits trial. Claire's body has not been found. And I am rebuilding a life that looks, from the outside, stable. Yet sometimes, when I pass a reflective building at night and catch my own gaze in the glass, I wonder something I never say out loud. If I had met him at a different moment, if I had needed power more than redemption, would I have stopped him? Or would we still be aligned? Because the truth is this: He wasn't the only one capable of crossing a line. I just chose to cross it in the opposite direction. And that doesn't make me innocent.